The morning of September 11, 2001, dawned clear and bright, on the east coast of the United States. It was a lovely autumn day with not a cloud in the sky. Just before 8 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 lifted off from the runway at Logan Airport, Boston. Climbing into the heavens, the plane turned west towards the Great American Prairies, and kept going. 6 hours later, Flight 11 touched down on the tarmac at Los Angeles International Airport. The passengers disembarked, collected their bags and walked away into the rest of their lives. Their morning could have unfolded very differently, according to documents found in the ruins of a terrorist camp in the mountains of Afghanistan. This was the date initially selected by the Islamist terrorist group Al Qaeda for a massive coordinated attack on the U.S. Al Qaeda's plan identified Flight 11 as a potential target, taken over by a team of hijackers. It was to be crashed into the World Trade Center as part of a devastating, concerted attack on major U.S. public buildings. Had the plan been carried out, thousands of people would have died. The shock and horror are almost impossible to imagine, and the history of our times would have spun off course with consequences we can barely begin to contemplate. But the attacks never happened. For whatever reason, the operation was cancelled and September 11, 2001, remains just another date. What happened next? For younger readers, here's a reminder: the 43rd U.S. President, George W. Bush, had come to office in January 2001 pledging to end the age of liberal intervention. He promised to serve as a clear-eyed realist, ending the tendency for the American military to act as the world's policeman. In reality, Bush largely stuck to the foreign policy template of his predecessor, Bill Clinton. In the first 2 years of his presidency, he ordered several airstrikes on Islamist terrorist camps, most famously the bombing of the Al Qaeda base in Tora Bora, Afghanistan, after U.S. embassies in Asia were attacked in 2002, but although some hawks suggested launching a ground invasion of Afghanistan, a few even calling for a global war on terror, Bush was having none of it. The United States, he maintained, had no vital interests in Afghanistan and he would not risk the life of a single U.S. Marine to kick out the Taliban. Another continuity was Bush's attitude to the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, who had been subject to Western sanctions and perennial air strikes since the 1990s. The sanctions continued, so did the air strikes, intensifying to a crescendo in the first weeks of 2003. That spring, the Bush administration made the catastrophic decision to back a CIA-planned invasion by a small force of Iraqi exiles, gambling they could rouse local support, storm Baghdad and overthrow Saddam. But Operation Iraqi Freedom, as it was called, proved an unmitigated disaster. There was no local uprising and Saddam's Republican Guard rapidly mopped up the invading force. Even a ferocious U.S. and British bombing campaign failed to make a difference, leaving Saddam more entrenched in power than ever. For many critics, the shambles of the Iraqi operation was entirely typical of the Bush administration. Again and again, his Democratic opponents insisted that he was failing to take the threat of radical Islam seriously, while his much-vaunted domestic reforms ebbed into the sand. In November 2004, the U.S. electorate delivered a harsh verdict, ending the Bush presidency after a single term, the same fate that had befallen his father. The following January, Al Gore took the oath of office on the steps of the Capitol, having avenged his nail-biting defeat 4 years earlier. Was the Gore presidency a golden age, then? Not a bit of it. Although Gore promised to concentrate on fighting climate change, other issues soon overwhelmed him. Chinese competition was eating into American manufacturing. Russia's war against Georgia triggered talk of a new Cold War, and the uprising against the Taliban in Afghanistan sent more than 2 million refugees fleeing across Asia. Then came the financial crisis of 2007-08. Gore insisted that his swift economic intervention had saved the world. The American voters clearly didn't agree. After a narrow defeat by the populist Mike Huckabee, he went down as yet another failed one-term president. Similar aftershocks were felt in Britain. Here, Labour's Tony Blair had spent much of the early 2000s chafing at what he saw as U.S. passivity abroad, though his critics insisted this was merely a deflection from the timidity of his own reform agenda at home. After winning a third landslide victory in 2005, Blair initially promised to step aside, but then changed his mind. A backbench coup 2 years later came close to bringing him down, but at last he summoned the courage to sack his chancellor, Osama Bin Laden's greatest victory.